He should have been there. Not everybody can make a phone call to the President of the United States, you know. McGeorge Bundy can. He didn't, but he could have. He's one of the people who can. Secretary of State certainly can. Secretary of Defense certainly can. The Director of Central Intelligence certainly can. But Dulles was out of the country. Bissell, he's not able to call the president directly. Neither is Cabell. Rusk can. But Bundy, at the direction of Rusk, calls and informs Cabell at 9:30 in the evening to cancel the airstrikes. And he tells Cabell, if you want to have any further discussion about this, you're going to have it with Secretary Rusk. So Cabell calls Rusk and asks if he can come over to his office. Rusk says yes. So Rusk and Bissell, Cabell calls Bissell and says, we got to go over to Secretary of State's office because they want to cancel the airstrikes. So they're heading over there. In the meantime, Jake Esterling gets word that the airstrikes have been canceled. I haven't figured out quite how he got word of it yet. I'll let you know on another occasion. So Esterling gets a hold of Hawkins, who was in CIA headquarters, the operational headquarters at the time, and tells him that they've been canceled. So Hawkins tries to locate Cabell and Bissell, and he finds out that Bissell's over at Secretary of State Rusk's office, and he calls him over there. And he tells Bissell, you know, you got to change his mind. I mean, this is crazy. We have to have control of the air. And he gives him a list of items that he must go over, et cetera, et cetera. He gets off the phone. So Cabell and Bissell talk for, you know, by the time they get to the office, according to their own memo, it was 10:15. So now it's 10:15. There's an hour difference in time, by the way, from Puerto Cabezas, Nicaragua, and which is Central Standard Time, to East Coast time, which in Cuba, which is the same as the East Coast. So there's a letter that the two of them, that Cabell and Bissell wrote to General Maxwell Taylor. Okay, and before I get to the letter, let me give everybody a context for it. Following the failure of the Bay of Pigs, and again, I know I haven't gotten to the immediate cause of failure yet, which I will in a second, but following the failure, President Kennedy formed something called the Cuban Study Group. The Cuban Study Group consisted of 4 individuals. The first individual was the Director of Central Intelligence. Understandably, he would be on it because it was his operation. Admiral Arleigh Burke, who was the Chief of Naval Operations, was also on it, and it makes sense that he would be as well, because there was a lot of military planning that went into this. Was an amphibious assault, after all, and there was a lot of support that came from the military, although it was covert support. But it was important to get his input on it. And you know, if you only have one of them in, they're going to paint themselves as an angel and paint the other side as the devil. So you'd have to have the military and the intelligence community separately represented. And then you have Robert Kennedy, obviously JFK's most trusted advisor and confidant. He was the Attorney General, so he was on it as well. And then Maxwell Taylor was probably the most highly regarded military officer of the time. I mean, he was in retirement during the Bay of Pigs. So he was kind of the perfect person to bring out of retirement to oversee this, because he had great understanding of military operations. He had great understanding also of the intelligence community's connections to the military and military operations. He had so much experience in these matters, and he was a fairly neutral party, being that he wasn't even he had already retired. See, he didn't have a dog in the fight. He didn't have anything to defend. So he could be a very good, knowledgeable third party to get to the bottom of what went wrong. So that's what the Cuban Study Group was, and that's who they were. Okay, and excuse me, they had to figure out what the immediate cause of failure. You know, there's a lot of stuff that went wrong. Okay, and it's kind of like one of these interesting things. You know, sometimes. Sometimes something can go wrong that in a plan. Let's say there's 15 different aspects to a plan, and 12 of them go wrong. 12 of the aspects go wrong, and so the entire plan falls apart. But sometimes one of the 15 aspects of the plan is a keystone. You know, it's a bearing wall of a building, and you only have to pull that one, and all the rest of them crumble. So it doesn't matter how well the rest of them were built. That one pulled out, everything will crumble. And that's what happened at the Bay of Pigs. It's not so much that the plan was bad. I mean, we just heard that report, you know, 3 days before from General Hawkins. He was all over it. And, you know, so the plan was a good plan if it had been followed, but it wasn't followed. So they were tasked with finding out what the immediate cause of failure was. And I'm not going to read it all because it's a long report, obviously. I'm not even going to read the whole portion that's important, but memorandum number 2 of the Cuban Study Group report is titled Immediate Causes of Failure of the Operation Zapata. And that's too long for me to read the whole thing as well, okay? But I will go to the salient, to the most, the parts most poignant to our discussion. It says the proximate cause of failure under number 1 was a shortage of ammunition, which developed from the first day. And I'm just skipping through them quickly until I get to the ones that are most important. Number 2, it says there were 3 primary reasons for the shortage of ammunition. Okay, number 3 says far more serious was the loss of the freighters, the Rio Escondido and the Houston through air attack at 9:30 on the morning of April 17th. So that's well after dawn, 4 hours roughly after dawn. Number 4, the air attack, which sunk these ships, caused all others in the landing area to be put out to sea. As the only available protection in the absence of control of the air, with the order to rendezvous 50 miles off the coast. Number 5, the Caribe was so far away that its cargo, principally aviation supplies, was never available for movement to Blue Beach while the fight lasted. Number 6. Okay, now we're getting closer to the stuff that's really important. I'm going to read this one, all of 6 and all of 7. By the time the supplies were transferred and the convoy had started north, it was too late to hope to resupply the beach under cover of darkness. The convoy commander asked CIA Operational Headquarters, Washington, for destroyer escort and U.S. Navy jet cover, without which he believed that he would lose his ships to air attack the next morning. He added that without U.S. Navy support, the Cuban crew would mutiny if sent back to the beach. Now, first of all, here's the first huge chink in the armor, right? They're asking for direct U.S. intervention already. Well, we know that was never a part of the plan, and they were never promised it, and they were never expecting to get it. But by now, something had already gone wrong, which we'll get to in a second. They shouldn't have had to even be concerned at this stage, but they were. Number 7, as a result of these messages, CIA headquarters, feeling that it would be futile to order these ammunition aircraft to attempt a daylight land unloading, called off the mission, and the attempt to get ammunition to the beach by sea ended. The president was not requested for specific authority to extend the air cover to protect the ammunition convoy. So even though they were asking for U.S. Navy jet cover and it was refused, Kennedy was never even asked at this point for it. Okay? So he never refused it. He wasn't even asked. Okay? Then on number 8, it says, this one's the longest, I'm not going to read all of it, but I'm going to cut to the chase pretty quickly. They name a whole series of things that went wrong that caused the failure. It says, the effectiveness of the Castro Air Force over the beach resulted from a failure to destroy the airplanes on the ground before or concurrently with the landing. In parentheses, it says particularly the T-33s, whose importance was not fully appreciated in advance. And farther down on number 8, after they've listed a whole bunch of other stuff, it says, the cancellation of the strikes planned at dawn on D-Day as the final item. And it says, the last mentioned was probably the most serious as it eliminated the last favorable opportunity to destroy the Castro Air Force on the ground. And then it says, finally, there was the failure to carry the issue to the president when the opportunity was presented and explained to him with proper force the probable military consequence of a last-minute cancellation. So the immediate cause of failure was directly related to that, what I'm calling linchpin, the bearing wall of the building, right? It caused all the other problems, the shortage of ammunition, the shortage of supply, the sinking of the ships, right? The being pinned on the beach by Castro's forces, the shooting down of 16 B-26 bombers. See, that was all caused by what? Because Castro had an operational Air Force that got airborne. Well, that shouldn't have happened. The plan didn't go as it had been laid out. It was altered. And who altered it? Well, Stevenson. He got embarrassed at the UN. He got upset. He had a conniption fit. He called Rusk on the 16th. Rusk went along with that, called Bundy without consulting the president. He calls Cabell. Cabell and Bissell rush over to Rusk's office. Hawkins says, oh my God, this can't happen. Are you kidding me? So what happens? That brings me now back to where I was before I went off to the Cuban study group. Part of the Cuban study group was to find out exactly what went wrong. And so they got everybody's statement. And one of the statements that they got came from Cabell and Bissell. Basically, Taylor saying, look, I want you to write it down. I want you to write down to me what happened. So Cabell and Bissell write a memo to General Maxwell Taylor dated 9 May 1961. And it says basically what I just told you. And I won't read the whole thing, but this is in their own words. This isn't coming from Bobby. This isn't, Bobby trying to make the president look good. And so, no. This came, there's signatures on it. Okay, Cabell and Bissell, both of them. So it says at about 9:30 p.m. on 16 April, D-1, I was called in the CIA headquarters for the Cuban operation by the special assistant to the president, Mr. McGeorge Bundy. He notified me that we would not be permitted to launch airstrikes the next morning until they could be conducted from a strip within the beachhead. Any further consultation regarding this matter should be with the Secretary of State. Okay? So, well, that's just, are you kidding me right now? That's a complete reversal of the most important aspect of this entire operation. The one thing that could go wrong and screw everything else up, even if everything else was perfect, that's what was done. My presentation was called Sabotage at the Bay of Pigs, Len, and I said it for a reason. Because, it's one thing to get the landing spot wrong and not realize that there's coral there. Okay, I guess you could make that mistake. It's one thing to not realize that you're not going to get a real good guerrilla response out of these people because possibly because the Escambray Mountains are so far away. I guess, that could have been an oversight. It's possible that, there's a number of things that could have been, but it wouldn't have made the whole operation crumble and be such a disaster. So it's real interesting to me that these really very high-level people in government make a critical reversal of a military operation plan. This is no longer a covert plan already. We can see that, right? Well, I guess it kind of could have been. How could it have been? If they wouldn't have reversed the order. Because just right at dawn, they would have taken out all the planes on the ground. See, now you've got a completely different ball game. Completely different ball game. So, their own letter says, Cabell called the secretary, and Bissell and he went over at 10:15. And they told the Secretary of State, and I'm paraphrasing everything here, but I'm not embellishing in any way, shape, or form, that the Secretary said that Ambassador Stevenson's attitude, he had insisted that the airstrikes had to be canceled and they were impossible for the U.S. to sustain a position of, plausible deniability. And the Secretary of State stated that such a result was unacceptable, and so they had to cancel the strikes. It says, paragraph 4 says, in the light of this, he asked that we describe the implications of the decision. We told him that the time was such, and in parentheses it says now almost 11 o'clock p.m., that it was now physically impossible to stop the overall landing operation as the convoy was at that time just about beginning to put the first boat ashore, and that failure to make airstrikes in the immediate beachhead area the first thing in the morning would clearly be disastrous. I informed him that there would be 4 effects of the cancellation order as it applied to strikes against Cuban airfields. Now, I believe these 4 effects are what Hawkins had, told Bissell to make sure you make clear, right? Now, I'm not going to read all of them because there's no reason to. We know it would be a disaster, right, for the reasons we've already given, Len. So the line it out for him, Cabell and Bissell, okay? At the end of it, this one I will read, paragraph 5. After considering the foregoing, and again, this letter is from Cabell and Bissell to Maxwell Taylor. This is their account of what happened. After considering the foregoing, the Secretary of State agreed that strikes could be made in the immediate beachhead area, but confirmed that the planned airstrikes against Cuban airfields, and that's where the aircraft are on the ground, a harbor, and a radio broadcasting station could not be permitted, and the decision to cancel would stand. He asked if I should like to speak to the president. Mr. Bissell and I were impressed with the extremely delicate situation with Ambassador Stevenson and the United Nations and the risk to the entire political position of the United States and the firm position of the Secretary. We saw no point in my speaking personally to the president, and so informed the Secretary. So Cabell and Bissell made their case, and Rusk said, no, still can't do it. And then Rusk said, but if you really think that, you got to, and you haven't convinced me, but if you want to persuade the president, I am the Secretary of State. I can get him on the phone for you. Would you like me to do that? And they said no. Paragraph 6 says, our immediate problem then was quickly to dispatch the necessary order to the air base in Puerto Cabezas, carrying out the instructions to stop the planned airstrike and to require replanning and rebriefing of crews. Parentheses, this was barely accomplished as the order to cancel caught the crews in their cockpits, and that dovetails with precisely what Fletcher Prouty told us when he said that he got a call from the commander down at Puerto Cabezas begging him to try to find somebody in Washington that could let the pilots go. And Fletcher said he could hear the pilots in their cockpit. He couldn't hear the pilots, but he could hear the engines running because they were in the cockpits ready to go. And Fletcher even said he made a joke to the guy, kind of tongue-in-cheek, and said, well, why don't you just let him go, just tell him to go. And he said he knew that really couldn't happen, but and Fletcher couldn't do anything about it. And then the last paragraph of the letter from Cabell and Bissell to Maxwell Taylor says, and this is very important, Len, it says, and I want everybody to pay special attention to this one, okay? Because as you can see up to here, even according to CIA, Cabell and Bissell, two of the guys that Kennedy fired, they're even saying Kennedy didn't know. Bundy told us to not do it. We tried to talk Rusk into it, and he said not do it. And he said, you want to talk to the president? And we said no. So Kennedy hadn't even been consulted about this, okay? Now, the next morning, we're skipping, and I'm not skipping, their letter skips, okay? There's only 7 items here. I just read you number 6. Number 7 says, our next task was to try and compensate for the loss of effective airstrikes. In order to protect the shipping as it withdrew from the beachhead, I arranged with the Navy to stand by pending authority to give fighter cover. At 4:30 a.m., 17 April, D-Day, I called on the Secretary of State at his home and reiterated the need to protect the shipping. The Secretary telephoned the President and put me on the phone. After I made the request, the President asked that the Secretary be put back on. After conversation with the President, the Secretary informed me that the request for air cover was disapproved. But what I want to emphasize here is this is 4:30 in the morning on the 17th of April. What he's asking for is fighter aircraft cover from the USS Essex. That's not covert. What are we going to do? Get a bunch of A4s? Or maybe we can bring some F4 Phantoms from the Korean War out of retirement and try to put Cuban Castro markings on them and get a Cuban pilot in it and claim that it was defecting from Cuba. What do you think here? See, this is ridiculous. But this is what Kennedy gets thrown under the bus for. They're asking for direct U.S. military intervention. He said under no conditions would there be. He said it on the air at a press conference. He said it behind the scenes, and everybody knew that it was not part of the plan. The second thing that's important about this, Len, is this is 4:30 in the morning. The plane's in Puerto Cabezas, Nicaragua. It's about a 4.5, 5-hour flight to get from there to Cuba. So what the agency eventually did is they conflated the two. They took the planned airstrikes that should have left Puerto Cabezas at what? We're talking East Coast time 11. I mean, they should have left at 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock maybe from Puerto Cabezas, maybe a little later. in order to be able to get to the beach by dawn. See, just right around, just before dawn. So at 4:30 a.m., there's no way they're getting there in time to provide any cover. So Cabell and Bissell here, or Cabell, I'm sorry, is definitely not talking about the B-26s that were part of the plan. He's talking about direct U.S. intervention. So the only time that Kennedy was brought on the phone in this entire mess wasn't until 4:30 in the morning of D-Day on the 17th, the night when all the important decisions were being made about canceling the airstrikes on the 16th. Nobody even woke him up. Nobody even called him. Nobody even asked him. Okay? So Cabell and Bissell and Dulles all get fired from this. Most people don't realize, I always said to myself, what the heck happened to McGeorge Bundy? How did he get out of it? That seemed kind of odd to me. Seemed like he was in the middle of all that. Well, most people don't realize. Let me read you this. I've got a copy of it. The White House, Washington. Dear Mr. President, I think you should always have the easiest freedom in the choice and use of close associates. And so I think you ought to have on hand their resignations. Here is mine, to be accepted at your pleasure at any time. You know that I wish I had served you better in the Cuban episode, and I hope you know how I admire your own gallantry under fire in that case. If my departure can assist you in any way, I hope you will send me off. And if you choose differently, you will still have this letter for use when you may need it. Your assistants are yours to use, and one use is in charging the air when that is needed. Yours, McBundy. So McGeorge Bundy offered his letter of resignation following the Bay of Pigs as well. Kennedy didn't accept it. Not quite sure why, but it does appear that either it could be the case that Bissell and Cabell did not make a strong enough presentation to Rusk. But why would they not speak to the president when they're given the opportunity to do it? They even admit it in their own letter. This isn't something that Bobby Kennedy put into the Cuban study group to make Kennedy look better. This is their own letter. This is in their own words. They turned him down. He said, you want to talk to the... No, we don't need to talk to the president. So what did they do? What did the three of them do? Rusk and Bissell and Cabell, they light some cigars, have a couple of martinis, pick up the phone. Maybe we ought to call it a good attorney, one down in San Antonio, Mrs. M, somebody. Well, here she's probably not that good. But so you look at stuff like this and you go, wow, very, very interesting. So we know for sure at this point that Kennedy didn't order the cancellation of the planned, promised pre-dawn airstrikes. There's no question about it. It's right here in the record. So then we have to ask another question. I think we've already answered it, but I'm going to do it one more time. Could the president have ordered, while he was bound by the prohibitions of NSC 5412/2, could he have ordered U.S. Navy jets to provide air cover at any point during this operation? Okay? And the answer is no. Memorandum number 1 from the Cuban Study Group to President Kennedy, quote, from its inception, the plan had been developed under the ground rule that it must retain a covert character. That is, it should include no action which, if revealed, could not be plausibly denied by the United States and should look to the world as an operation exclusively conducted by Cubans. This ground rule meant, among other things, that no U.S. military forces or individuals could take part in combat operations. I don't know if it can get any clearer than that. That Kennedy never promised air cover in the form of U.S. military, was never planning to do it. It had never been a part of the plan. It wasn't even something that should have been needed. But the plan as it had originally been discussed was altered, and it wasn't Kennedy's doing. Okay? So the only other part I think that is of good note to note is the Foreign Relations of the United States also documents this as well. It says, the Secretary of State indicated subsequently that Cabell and Bissell's presentation led him to feel that while the airstrikes were indeed important, they were not vital. However, he offered them the privilege of telephoning the president in order to present their views to him. They saw no point in speaking personally to the president and so informed the Secretary of State. So there's multiple iterations of the same data that Kennedy was taken out of the loop and it was not him who canceled anything. I've covered most of what I wanted to cover. There's a couple lingering things that bother me to no end. There's a guy named Jack B. Pfeiffer, and Pfeiffer wrote, well, actually, I think he wrote it if I'm not mistaken, I think it was 1979. But anyway, he wrote a book, he had a manuscript called The Taylor Committee Investigation of the Bay of Pigs. And in November of 1984, he was a chief of the CIA's history staff, and he attempted to get that manuscript declassified. And it was unsuccessful. They refused to declassify it. The majority of it remained classified for more than 25 years, okay? It was declassified and approved for release 2 years ago, Len, July 25th, 2011, more than 50 years after the Bay of Pigs. So this is, most people haven't, seen any of that. And that's definitely worth reading because it gives a really good report and chronology to a point, except for the point where Pfeiffer lies. Okay, and I have no tolerance for this these days. It's unbelievable. I'm going to pull out this report he has is like 300 and something odd pages long. Okay, but when you scour down to the critical part again, all right, here's how and this guy worked directly for the Central Intelligence Agency when he wrote this stuff. It's funny, how they do stuff, right? They classify the lie anyway. See, isn't that interesting? They classified the lie, and then when it comes out, people have a tendency to think it's true. And so you read oh man, look at this. We got the true secret history of the Operation Zapata in the Bay of Pigs from the CIA's own files. We got the real deal here, guys. Look, it just got declassified. And then you start reading it and you get to hear that they declassified part of it's a lie. But most people buy it because it was kept secret. It says, once again, the reader is reminded of the comments which General Cabell made to Secretary of State Dean Rusk during the course. Now, here's the lie. Listen very, very carefully. Once again, the reader is reminded of the comments which General Cabell made to Secretary of State Dean Rusk during the course of the 16 April discussion on cancellation of the D-Day strikes. So this is the night of April 16th. Quote, when Secretary Rusk had the president on the other end of the telephone line, hang on a minute, didn't we just go through that? He never had the president on the other end of the line on the 16th, ever. Cabell and Bissell both signed their own names to their own letter, their own memorandum that they sent to Maxwell Taylor when he said, tell me what happened in your own words. They sent this, and it said they were offered to call the president, and they turned him down. He didn't have him on the line. It wasn't like Rusk was talking to the president. Well, okay, hang on, Mr. President. Now, what did you want me to tell him? What did you want me to tell him? Okay, yeah, he said this, blah, 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 blah. What? Okay, I'll tell him. No, that's not what's going on. They had a discussion in the office. And Rusk said no, and they kept objecting, and Rusk said, do you want to talk to the president? They said no. But what does this buffoon say? When Secretary Rusk had the president on the other end of the telephone line, and he's talking about the 16th of April, Rusk accurately transmitted to the president Cabell's fears that if the strikes were canceled, the success of the operation was in serious jeopardy, but to no avail. Can you believe this, Lynn? Can you believe it? This was just declassified. And the guy's lying through his teeth, just making it up as he goes along. And again, I want to bring everybody's attention back to the end of this letter that Cabell and Bissell signed. The time when Rusk had the president on the line was not in Rusk's office on the night of the 16th talking about the pre-dawn airstrikes. It was at Rusk's home. It says at 4:30 a.m., 17 April, I called on the Secretary of State at his home and reiterated the need to protect the shipping. So this was not a discussion about pre-dawn airstrikes to take out Castro's Air Force on the ground. It was already too late.